No archaeologist has found a diary written by Jesus. No Roman archive has handed us his case file. No first-century statue has his name carved under the face, and that is exactly where the historical question begins. Because for most people in the ancient world, that kind of evidence never existed. The case for Jesus as a real historical figure is not built on one magic artifact. It is built on a trail, early letters, hostile Roman memory, Jewish history, family names, execution under a known governor, and a movement that appears too quickly to explain away as pure invention. This is not a video about proving miracles. It is about something more basic, and in some ways more interesting. What kind of evidence should count when the person was not an emperor, not a general, not a king, but a Jewish preacher executed at the edge of the Roman world? The first trap is the word proof. When people ask whether Jesus was real, they often imagine a modern standard, a birth certificate, a government file, a courtroom transcript, a named grave, a photograph, a signature. Ancient history almost never works that way. Most people who lived in the first century left nothing personal behind. Not because they were imaginary, but because they were poor, local, ordinary, and written about only when someone powerful had a reason to care. Jesus was not a Roman senator. He did not command legions. He did not mint coins. He did not build a city and stamp his name on the walls. If the question is, do we have the kind of record an emperor might leave? The answer is no. But that is the wrong comparison. The better question is how historians handle any ancient person who appears in biased, fragmentary, late, copied, and sometimes hostile sources. They look for convergence. Does more than one source remember the same basic person? Are some sources early? Are some sources outside the believer group? Do any sources mention awkward details that would not be invented easily? Do the claims fit the known world of the time? That is why the historical Jesus question is not solved by one smoking gun. It is a case file made from scraps. The earliest surviving Christian writings are not the Gospels. They are the letters of Paul. That matters because Paul is not writing a polished biography of Jesus. He is writing arguments, instructions, rebukes, and urgent letters to communities that already know the basic story. That makes the letters frustrating. Paul does not stop and say, "Now, let me prove Jesus existed." He assumes it. He refers to Jesus as a recent figure inside Jewish history. He speaks of his death by crucifixion. He knows a tradition about a final meal. He knows people connected to the earliest Jerusalem movement. In Galatians, he says that when he went to Jerusalem, he met Josephus and James, whom he calls the Lord's brother. For historians, that is not a small detail. It puts Paul, a writer from within a few decades of the crucifixion, in contact with people remembered as close to Jesus. You do not have to accept Paul's theology to notice the historical problem this creates. If Jesus was only a myth floating in the air, why does Paul treat him as a recent Jewish man whose followers and family can still be encountered? Paul is not neutral. He is a believer. But early biased evidence is still evidence, especially when it casually preserves names, relationships, conflicts, and a humiliating death. The crucifixion is one of the strongest pieces of the historical puzzle. Not because crucifixion proves Christianity. It does not. But because crucifixion was a shameful Roman execution. It was a public humiliation. It was the kind of death Rome used to crush rebels, slaves, and people marked as threats. For early followers trying to proclaim Jesus as God's chosen one, this was not an easy starting point. A crucified Messiah was not an obvious marketing strategy. That is why historians pay attention when multiple streams of tradition agree on it. Paul centers Jesus' death on a cross. The Gospels narrate it. Tacitus, writing as a Roman aristocrat with contempt for Christians, says that Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius under Pontius Pilate. That is not a believer trying to make Christianity look noble. It is a hostile Roman memory explaining where a disliked movement came from. This does not tell us what Jesus said at every moment. It does not prove the resurrection. It does not settle theology. But it does make the simplest historical outline harder to dismiss. A Jewish teacher gathered followers. Roman power killed him. The movement did not disappear. Then there is Josephus. Josephus was a first-century Jewish historian. He wrote in Greek under Roman patronage after the Jewish War. He was not a Christian missionary. He had his own loyalties, his own politics, and his own reasons for telling Jewish history to a Roman world. His writings contain two famous places connected to Jesus. One is the larger passage in Antiquities, Book 18, often called the Testimonium. That passage is complicated. Most scholars think later Christian copyists touched it because parts of it sound too Christian for Josephus. But many also think it may preserve a more modest original reference underneath. That is not the cleanest evidence. The cleaner piece is in Book 20. Josephus tells a story about the high priest Annas, who brings charges against James and others. In identifying James, Josephus refers to him as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. It is a brief line. That is why it matters. It is not a sermon. It is not a miracle story. It is not trying to convert anyone. Josephus is explaining which James he means. The sentence assumes that this Jesus was a recognizable identifier. Again, this does not prove doctrine. But it gives historians something stubborn. A non-Christian Jewish author, late in the 1st century, referring to James through Jesus called Christ. Tacitus gives the story a different kind of edge. He was a Roman senator and historian writing in the early 2nd century. In Annals, Book 15, he describes Nero blaming Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. Tacitus does not like them. His language is hostile. He calls the movement a destructive superstition. He places its origin in Judea and says it spread to Rome. Then he gives the key line. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. For the historian, this is valuable not because Tacitus loved Christianity. He clearly did not. It is valuable because he has no obvious reason to invent a founder executed by a Roman governor. His point is to explain the origin of a despised group, not to defend their claims. Could Tacitus have learned some of this from what Christians were saying? Possibly. Ancient historians used mixed sources. We do not have his notebook. But even then, the passage shows that by Tacitus' time, Roman elite memory understood Christians as followers of a founder executed in Judea under Pilate. The trail is widening. Christian letters, Jewish history, Roman contempt. Different motives, same basic outline. Archaeology enters the story differently. It does not give us Jesus' signature. It gives us the world around him. Pontius Pilate is not just a name in Christian texts. A Latin inscription from Caesarea preserves his name and title. Caesarea was the Roman administrative center on the coast. The stone does not mention Jesus, and we should not pretend it does. But it anchors the kind of official who appears in the execution tradition. Other pieces of 1st century archaeology help in the same indirect way. Synagogues, ossuaries, coins, stone vessels, mikvaot, Roman roads, Galilean villages, Jerusalem's priestly world, and the pressure of imperial rule. This is context evidence. It cannot say, therefore, every gospel scene happened exactly as written. But it can say something more restrained. The movement remembered Jesus inside a real 1st century Jewish and Roman world, not in a fantasy landscape detached from history. The places, authorities, customs, tensions, and social boundaries are not random inventions floating in mythic space. They belong to a recognizable world. This is also where we need to reject weak evidence. A claim is not stronger because it is sensational. A relic that suddenly appears centuries later does not become proof because people want it to be holy. A tomb headline does not settle the historical Jesus question because a name was common. A forged inscription can damage the entire discussion by making the real evidence look like another trick. The best historical case is less glamorous. No glowing object, no secret chamber, no perfect Roman file. Instead, the case is cumulative. Paul writes early and knows people tied to the Jerusalem movement. Josephus mentions James in relation to Jesus called Christ. Tacitus connects Christus with execution under Pilate. Archaeology supports the political and social world in which that execution tradition sits. Each piece has limits. Together they make a myth-only explanation less economical. That is the point. Good history is often less dramatic than bad proof, but it survives harder questions. So what can historians say with confidence? Not as theology, not as worship, not as anti-religion, just as ancient history. Most historians of the period accept that Jesus of Nazareth existed. They usually place him in early 1st century Jewish Galilee and Judea. They see him as a teacher or preacher connected with the kingdom of God. They accept that he gathered followers and was executed by Roman authority under Pontius Pilate. Beyond that, questions become harder.
What exactly did he say? Which sayings are earliest? How should the miracle stories be read? What did he think would happen next? How did his followers come to believe he had been raised?
How much did later communities shape the memories they preserved? Those are real debates. But they are debates about a historical figure, not usually about whether there was no figure at all. That distinction matters. A person can be historical without every later claim about him being historically provable. A movement can preserve real memory and also interpret it through faith. That is not unusual. That is ancient history. The argument against Jesus often begins with silence. Why did no Roman bureaucrat write a surviving report? Why no contemporary inscription? Why no personal manuscript? Why no neutral daily newspaper from Jerusalem? But silence has to be measured against what normally survives. We do not possess complete archives for most local executions in Judea. We do not have detailed files for thousands of people Rome killed. We do not have biographies for most village teachers, healers, prophets, rebels, or troublemakers. The ancient world was not built to preserve the lives of the poor. So the absence of one perfect contemporary record is not surprising. What is surprising is that a marginal executed figure became visible at all in so many different kinds of memory. A few decades later, communities across the Mediterranean are arguing about him. A Jewish historian can identify a man through him. A Roman historian can explain a hated movement through his execution. Later sources disagree, interpret, defend, attack, and expand the story. That is not the footprint of an emperor. It is the footprint of a man whose followers transformed defeat into proclamation. The most honest answer is not the loudest one. No, we do not have a stone that says Jesus stood here. No, Tacitus and Josephus do not prove miracles. No, archaeology does not turn faith claims into laboratory facts. But the opposite claim also fails. Jesus is not a figure who appears out of nowhere in a distant medieval legend. The trail begins close to the 1st century, inside Jewish and Roman history, with sources that do not all want the same thing. A believer writes letters before the Gospels are finished. A Jewish historian names a brother connected to Jesus called Christ. A Roman aristocrat hostile to Christians remembers their founder as executed under Pilate. Archaeology places Pilate, Caesarea, Judea, and the Roman system in the world the sources describe. That is why the historical case is stronger than many people expect and narrower than many apologists want. It probably proves a person. It does not prove every claim made about that person. And maybe that is what makes the story worth telling. The evidence for Jesus is not a single holy object. It is a trail left by enemies, followers, relatives, rulers, cities, and the memory of an execution Rome thought would end the story.